Would you wait? You're not doing this, Mr. Well, maybe. Behind time already. Minutes to introduce this motion.
Gormagot, and I will be sharing time with some of my colleagues, Cian Corla. I tabled this motion because, like in many areas of healthcare at the moment, we have a lot of burnout and fatigue. And I've met over the last number of weeks and months many ambulance paramedics and members of the National Ambulance Service. And I'm sure the Minister will be aware of, as well, of a lot of the pressures that the National Ambulance Service are under. And the words burnout, low morale and fatigue are words that we are hearing a lot of in relation to our frontline healthcare services, and it's no different in the National Ambulance Service. Yesterday I met with the SIB2 representatives, but also with many ambulance paramedics on a Zoom call. And again, I heard at first hand the consequences of what's happening in relation to the lack of capacity in our National Ambulance Service. No breaks, Minister, for many of those who are on long shifts. Often ambulance paramedics working 12 hours, they can't get a break, they can't even get a lunch break, and many of them talk about a desk top lunch because they simply cannot get time to eat properly, and that has a consequence obviously on them. The long hours that they work, very often at the end of their shift, if there's 15 minutes or 20 minutes left at the end of their shift, they can be given a call out to somewhere that's 100 miles, 200 miles, even 300 miles away from their destination, adding, again, very lengthy hours onto what already is a long shift. And many more consequences for the ambulance paramedics themselves. And there is real fatigue and there is real burnout. But there's also consequences for patients. We hear more and more anecdotal evidence from patients and from families, people waiting too long for an ambulance to arrive. And I put that directly to ambulance paramedics I met, including those from SIB2 last night, and they say that's precisely what is happening, that they cannot stand over a service where the response times are not what they should be. One ambulance paramedic remarked to me that he came onto his shift last week. He started his shift at 7:30 p.m. and his first call was to respond to a call that came in from a patient at 11:38 a.m. in the morning. And then he has to respond to that call, arriving 6 or 7 hours later and having then to deal with that challenge through no fault of his own. And there is an awful lot of what's called moral injury here, Minister, in relation to the impact that has on frontline staff. If you're an ambulance paramedic, you want to do your best. You want to make sure that you take whatever call is there. A child could be sick, an older person has fallen, and yet you know that you need a break. You know that you're coming towards the end of your shift. And you have to deal with all of that day in, day out. And that moral injury I'm hearing more of, not just in relation to the National Ambulance Service, but right across our healthcare system. And it all comes back to a lack of capacity. I know, Minister, and I can preempt some of what's in your response, there has been a number of working groups established by the National Ambulance Service to look at some of these issues in relation to breaks and late call-outs at the end of shifts in many of these areas, but they haven't been actioned. And what we need to see is even these small steps implemented as quickly as possible. I also know that there is a capacity review being conducted. When I talk to ambulance paramedics, they relate to me the nearest comparable region or country is Scotland. That has a staff complement of 5,000. We in this state have a staff complement of just over 2,000, so we fall far behind. Our fleet needs to be greater than it is. The number of paramedics needs to be greater than it is. We need more EMTs, we need more staff generally in our ambulance services. And the consequences of that not happening are ambulances not arriving on time, and more burnout and more fatigue. I've also been told by hospital managers in some hospitals across the state that ambulances can be parked up for hours on end because they don't have the beds to transfer or decant patients from the ambulances into the hospital itself. It can happen for hours on end, and we hear it all of the time, but when hospital managers tell you, I had ambulances outside of my hospital, sometimes a fleet of ambulances parked up for hours because we don't have the beds to be able to release the patients into them, and then the ambulances acting almost as hospital trolleys. Now, how mad is that? And how frustrating is that for ambulance paramedics and for people who use the service? So this motion, Minister, is is a sincere attempt to say to you that we need action. I hope, because I think you should be able to support this motion, that you can support it. We're calling for the National Capacity Review to be complete, to be published when it is complete, and then properly resourced. And let's put in place a strategy for the National Ambulance Service that properly resources it, that increases the fleet, increases the personnel, ensures that we can provide a fair service, make sure that ambulance paramedics are fairly treated. Let's address the issues of burnout, address the issues of morale and fatigue, and put in place a plan that they can have confidence in. And I know that there is new personnel at the head of the National Ambulance Service as well, and I wish them well, and I want them to succeed. Minister, I would ask that you would support this private member's motion, but more than that, I would ask that you action the asks which are in the motion.
Daly, please.
Last week, myself and David Cullinan met with representatives of the National Ambulance Service to discuss the crisis at University Hospital Kerry. And while we were there, what came up time and time again is problems with the ambulance service because they're intrinsically linked. Every day almost my office is contacted by people who cannot get health care due to the ongoing crisis. And very worryingly, a common concern is the ability or inability to get an ambulance service. People are referred to the emergency department by their GPs or have an emergency but must wait hours for them. It's commonplace to hear of ambulances being sent from Limerick and Cork to take Kerry people to University Hospital Kerry and vice versa. I spoke just before coming down here to Rita Sheehy from Dingle, who worked in medical practice for almost 20 years, and she said that things went from bad to worse 6 years ago when the call centres were centralised. She told me that at the last weekend that one of the ambulances from her area went to Roscarbery, another one went to Union Hall. The Ken Mayer ambulance ended up in Waterford. Now, I'm not sure, given the crisis in healthcare in Kerry, that there is an understanding that we have 3 peninsulas, that we have a very spread out county, but we only have the resources for 150,000 people, and we don't even have that. We have a population during the summer months of close to 500,000 people, and the services quite clearly just are not there. Young children and elderly people end up being driven to hospital with family members, and this creates huge risk and places parents and family members in a bind. Should they wait for paramedics to come or risk driving their loved ones to hospital before it's too late? People have to face these choices due to a lack of ambulances in Kerry. I've previously asked the Minister to base ambulances in Killorglin and Abbeyfield. Both areas are adjacent to communities grossly underserved in normal times and feel completely abandoned during this crisis. I invite you once again, Minister, to come down to Kerry, go to the hospital, meet people and meet with the ambulance service. I'm increasingly hearing stories of ambulances waiting for hours to transfer patients into the hospital. It's common to hear of 5-hour waits, sometimes 8-hour waits, and staff shortages and a lack of beds means that highly vulnerable patients and paramedics are waiting too long to be seen. It's not good enough, Minister. You need to take action. Please do something before it's too late and someone loses their life.
For some time now, our ambulance services have been under huge strain. It's not unusual to receive complaints from people having to wait for long periods for an ambulance, even after using the emergency numbers. People have to wait up to an hour or more for an ambulance to arrive. On reaching the designated hospital, in some cases, when they get to the hospital, an ambulance has to wait outside with the patient due to overcrowding in the emergency department. In Dublin North West, which I represent, there are 3 hospitals in use for the area, Beaumont, the Mater and Connolly Hospital, with each under huge pressure because of the wider issues that our health system faces with lack of resources. These hospitals are only a 10 to 20 minutes drive away for most people in the Dublin North West constituency. But if you're ringing 999 for an ambulance, it's because you have a medical emergency and need help urgently, and for whatever reason you can't make that journey without the help of an ambulance. The National Ambulance Service has pointed out that due to the lack of a single call and dispatch model for Dublin, the dispatch process in Dublin is not as seamless as in other areas, and it is not possible to integrate all calls in one database to ensure improved planning and performance monitoring. That needs to be looked at. We are also being told that ambulance units are being sent from hundreds of kilometres away to get to a call out in Dublin to fill in all these gaps. which then takes away resources from the area they are supposed to be based in. It makes no sense. Our motion calls for many measures that need to be looked at, but at the end of the day, the point is we need an urgent review and improvement of ambulance resources and A&E resources for patients on arrival. We need ambulance services to be properly funded with more staff, equipment and more ambulance vehicles. Patients can't continue to be left waiting for long in an emergency situation. Lives here are at risk. The ambulance workers are in the front line. They are under so much stress and strain, especially since COVID. They're exhausted, burnt out, and they need help. Thank you.
MUNSTER.
We're all aware of the enormous pressures on our health service, and COVID laid bare the enormous deficits, and we're reaching crisis point again in terms of hospital and ICU capacity. The ambulance service, like many parts of our health service, is also in crisis. Staff are reporting that morale is at an all-time low. Staff are completely burnt out. Paramedics are often travelling over 200 kilometres to a call-out due to disparities in ambulance coverage in different parts of the country. Staff have reported working over 15 hours a day, often as a result of having to travel hundreds of kilometres towards the end of their shifts. It's little wonder that healthcare workers aren't being enticed to stay here or to come here to work. The healthcare system is dysfunctional, and it is affecting the health and lives of those who work in it. And this is obviously bad news for patients. I've heard from many people in my constituency who are upset by the length of time their loved ones have been left waiting on an ambulance. Last year, a 95-year-old woman who was gravely ill was left waiting for 3.5 hours for an ambulance. And during the summer, a GAA player appeared to be seriously injured on a playing field, and an ambulance was called. He was a 5-minute drive from Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, but it was decided that he should not be moved given his injuries. He waited 1 hour and 40 minutes, and it turns out that the ambulance came from Tala, as there was none available locally. The National Ambulance Service is missing its targets in terms of response for life-threatening call-outs, and we know that there are elderly and vulnerable people waiting hours for ambulances. Service, and the best way we can do that is by increasing capacity in the service so that they aren't so overworked and overstretched, and so that we aren't over-relying on private ambulances. We need to identify where additional funding is required. We need to phase out private services, fill vacancies, increase staffing and expand the ambulance fleet to meet demand. We need to do all of this for the sake of patients all across the state, and for the sake of paramedics and healthcare workers who have given so much to us in the last year and a half, and long before that too, Minister.
Paul Donnelly.
Minister, I'd like to thank my colleague Deputy David Cullinane for bringing forward this motion. We need action, and we need it now. The red tape in recruitment, which was talked about earlier on, needs to be removed. We need more beds in our hospital system, and we need to increase the hospital capacity to avoid patients being left waiting in ambulances and on trolleys. We need to expand our ambulance fleet and ensure that all communities, rural and urban, are properly served. And the figures of 2,500 staff for the ambulance service and the equivalent in Scotland is 5,000 is just not acceptable. There's many people here in this room who have had to call an ambulance at some stage in their lives, or indeed, unfortunately, may have had to travel in one as a patient. For the vast majority of people, calling an ambulance is a last resort for when they're really ill. It's done under extreme circumstances with great reluctance. So when it's called, people really do expect an appropriate timeline. However, that's increasingly not the case both in our city and rural communities. I've heard of people waiting an hour or more for an ambulance. However, my family had to come face to face with the reality of how under pressure they really are just this day last week. My mother is in her 80s. She was very sick last week with an infection, and the ambulance was called at 1 o'clock. Despite numerous calls throughout the day, the ambulance didn't turn up until 5:30 p.m. We live in East Wall, and my mother went to the Mater Hospital, which is just up the road. Do you believe that that's acceptable in a modern health service? Because certainly I don't believe so. I was shocked, actually, just even last night looking at the RTE programme, and to hear that the first recorded patient that had to wait overnight in a trolley was in 1998. Today, there are 409 people on trolleys as we stand here today. So, when you think about it, 1998 to today, that was the first recorded one. I think that's absolutely shocking. It's not acceptable, and there are solutions. It's time to get on with listening to the workers and the management and people here in this chamber, and to implement the solutions that are out there. Not to do so with extreme urgency is to continue to put people's lives at risk.
Anyone else offering on this? Deputy Conway-WALSH.
Minister, it's very obvious we need an urgent review of ambulance resources and the configuration to ensure this emergency service is adequately resourced and run efficiently and effectively. And I do want to acknowledge the Trojan work of the dedicated paramedics and other emergency staff. I have seen firsthand what their absolute dedication, and they deserve much better than what they're being presented with at the moment. We're talking about protecting lives here and saving lives and retaining and supporting and protecting ambulance workers that are burnt out from long, exhausting shifts. Minister, how can you stand over an emergency service that's constructed and resourced in a way that means seriously ill patients are waiting up to 2.5 hours for an ambulance? The bottom line is we need to stop the crisscrossing of ambulances travelling hundreds of kilometres by expanding our ambulance fleet and ensuring that rural communities are served properly. Yesterday I joined the nurses outside Mayo University Hospital when they were protesting about conditions and about the safety, and that was the most word that they used was the concern they had for safety of patients and safety of staff, and that should concern you, and it certainly should concern us all. I hear accounts of routine delays of offloading patients at an emergency department due to lack of capacity. They have raised the issue of severe lack of nursing staff to take over the care of patients from the ambulances, and this is what's happening. Right now in Mayo, the nurse-to-patient ratio can be as high as 1 to 15 instead of 1 to 7 due to the staffing shortages there. And that is the problem, where ambulances are lined up outside the hospital. 2 weeks ago, I spoke to a family of an 85-year-old woman, a cancer patient, who waited outside Mayo University Hospital for over 6 hours with no morphine as she was referred by Westtalk. No morphine, in pain, outside Mayo University Hospital. The other point I want to make to you, Minister, is it should be much easier for UK-trained paramedics to transfer their registrations to work in Ireland. They tell me that it's easier for them to go to Australia than it is to come back to their own country. So we need to address the crisis in the ambulance service and indeed in the wider health service. I want to ask you as well, Minister, in relation to the National Ambulance Service and the rollout of the booster vaccine, particular to those that they rolled it out before. Are they going to be doing the same thing this time, and what's the timeline for that? So people who are in their 80s and 90s who are housebound, when are they going to get the booster vaccine, and is it going to be through the National Ambulance Service? Thank you.
Anyone else?
Last caller, there was an error in the previous slot for Sinn Féin. There was 2.5 minutes left, and they would have been for Deputy Kenny. So I'm asking that we would make up 12.5 minutes now, if that's agreeable. It's just exactly what it would have been. Is that fair enough? Yeah. So I'm sharing with Deputy Kenny, Deputy CROWE, Deputy KERRANE and Deputy Function, 2.5 minutes each. Is that okay? Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Minister, I just want to, obviously every TD will want to share with you the experience in their own constituency. So my home county, Donegal, has had huge problems with ambulance service in recent years. There are a number of families who have lost loved ones due to the length of time it took the ambulance to get there, and there's no doubt about that. And they have very courageously told their stories and campaigned for a better ambulance service. But I'm sorry to report to you, from speaking to people who work in the service in the last couple of days, that there just isn't enough personnel in place around the county. There's not enough ambulance bases, not enough ambulances, and not enough personnel to cover the county. On top of that, the major acute hospital is Letterkenny University Hospital. And if you look at the numbers of people on trolleys over the last number of weeks, is up there at the top. Right now, only University Hospital Limerick, which has a terrible experience with overcrowding and trolley people on trolleys in the emergency ward. But Letterkenny is second only to University Hospital Limerick, a massive number of people. So what you have is then backlog at the emergency department. We have ambulances backed up. And I can tell you from speaking to families, there have been many instances where there's been huge distress caused to patients, huge distress caused to the paramedics operating those ambulances, because their business is saving lives. They've done that. They've got the patient to the hospital only to face this backlog. It's utterly unacceptable working conditions. This is their business is saving lives. That's what they signed up to do. So what I'm saying to you, Minister, is to be clear, in Donegal, we do not have an adequate ambulance service. I don't think there's a recognition of the unique geography of the county, and the paramedics who work in that service are under unbelievable pressure. So you've got to deal with that, and you've got to help Letterkenny University Hospital with the crisis in beds, nurses and doctors. Those two crises in the ambulance service and in the acute hospital in Letterkenny lead to impossible working conditions for the frontline emergency workers who are working there, and they're being failed, and it's not acceptable. So, Minister, that's my plea to you, to look at that issue with your colleagues and to make it clear to the National Ambulance Service and the CELTA Hospital Group about all of that.
Deputy Sean CROWE.
People in Ireland are tired of the dire state of the public services that they rely on, and since the days of austerity, funding has been whittled away, and in many areas we're left with hollowed out services. Nowhere is this being seen more than in our health service, and we're told that all the extra money that the government are throwing at it when really we're standing still when it comes to services. Waiting lists continue to climb, overcrowding continues to worsen, and the National Ambulance Service and Emergency Service are at crisis point. We spend millions each year on private ambulance rather than improve the working conditions and strength of our ambulance services. Our motion calls tonight for life-threatening call-outs should be responded to within 19 minutes. The importance of the golden hour response time seems to be dangerously stretched when we hear stories of ambulance, having to travel further and further, and we're increasingly hearing stories of desperate families waiting long minutes and hours for an emergency response time. Ambulance left idling outside of hospitals due to overcrowding is wrong on so many levels and leads to unacceptably long shifts. National Ambulance staff are suffering from low morale, as we've heard, burnout, and is widespread across the service. And we cannot blame COVID for these problems, as these and other challenges were at breaking point before the pandemic. The government must urgently review the adequacy of the National Ambulance Service resources. It's vital that we identify exactly what is needed to phase out the use of private services, reduce reliance on overtime, fill vacancies and expand staffing and the ambulance fleet. So as part of this, what is needed is to provide adequate health care in this state. We also must provide more appropriate hospital beds to avoid patients left in the back of an ambulance and admit them to a hospital and into treatment. We cannot neglect public service in this country any longer. We need a government that works for the people, for workers and for their families.
Deputy Kathleen Function.
First of all, I just want to commend my colleague, Deputy Cullinan, for introducing this motion. Nowhere is it more evident how vital the service is than in a rural community and constituency like my own. And I would argue nowhere are funding cuts, staff shortages, burnout and inadequate facilities more keenly felt than in rural communities. And I know from the calls that I have got on this issue that the service is just not fit for purpose in Carlow and Kilkenny, and this is totally and utterly unfair to those who work in the sector. A recent incident reported in Carlow emerged where a third ambulance crew from Tipperary were sent to Tullow in Carlow, County Carlow, only to be diverted to New Ross and Wexford and then on to Kilkenny before being sent back to Carlow town. And this is a regular occurrence, just absolute craziness. Carlow's ambulance crew have been screaming out for a new depot as the current facilities on the ground of St Gimna's are completely unacceptable. And I think you should visit there, Minister, if you haven't already, because you would see just how inadequate they are. They need a new base, and I'm asking today that is prioritised. The shortage of paramedics in Carlow and Kilkenny was evident recently in the case of a constituent who had to wait on the side of the street for 2 hours, like this was not down to the fault of the people working in the sector that are absolutely overstretched and totally and utterly burnt out. Coupled with burnout and the crazy situation that staff are faced with, they're also working 18-hour shifts and having to face into very long drives home. Many actually just have to opt to stay in a local hotel if that's possible, just due to the tiredness. Paramedics seem to be being diverted all over the place, and life and death decisions are being made by overstretched and under-resourced paramedics, and it's just simply unacceptable. And I just want to reiterate how unfair it is to those working in the sector. We all know that if resources in an area are already responding to calls, the job is then given to the next available ambulance, which could be hours away from where the caller is. And in Carlow and Kilkenny, that could mean an ambulance being dispatched from anywhere in the country. In January 2020, SIP2 called for immediate and effective action be taken by the Minister for Health and HSE to relieve the immense pressure being experienced by ambulance professionals across the country. They were ignored, and the unacceptable situation of paramedics treating patients in loading bays of hospitals instead of hospital beds has continued. So I cannot impress enough that our services and personnel must be resourced so that they can perform their duties to the best of their abilities. And I just want to commend all those who work in that sector. I don't know how they do it, and their morale must be so low at times, but I just want to commend them. Thanks, Laskin Carla.
Kenny, you're the last speaker in this group.
No, Deputy KERRANE and Deputy Kenny.
Oh, Deputy KERRANE as well, I beg your pardon. Yeah, Deputy Kenny is next, and then Deputy KERRANE.
Minister, it's a number of years ago I met people in the ambulance staff in Sligo, and they told me that the arrangement was what they called dynamic deployment, and you think it was NATO on manoeuvres in the South Indian Ocean or something, but what it actually was code for was fewer ambulances over a wider area, basically. And it meant that ambulances from Sligo were spending a lot of their time going all the way up to Letterkenny or right over perhaps to Castlebar or away into the Midlands or up to Monaghan. And when an ambulance then locally was looked for, it wasn't there. We had a recent incident about 2 months ago, where there was a lady hit with a car in Carrick-on-Shannon. And there's an ambulance depot in Carrick-on-Shannon, and she lay alongside of the road for almost an hour and a half before an ambulance was able to come. And I think that's the experience of so many people out there when they call an ambulance 999 emergency. There's a crisis. Act fast. And we all hear all of these things, particularly when someone has a stroke or something like that, how there's such critical time to react and get the person to hospital and get them treated. And yet our ambulance service, which is there to do that, is simply failing and has failed for a long, long time. This isn't new news to any of us here in this chamber. I'm sure we know about this for quite some time. And in your speech you mentioned how there was, more resources being put in and there was more money being provided, but the experience of people isn't seeing those resources. That's the reality of it. And when I speak to the staff, they're in the same situation. There's fewer staff trying to do more work. And really what needs to happen here, Minister, is there needs to be a re-examination of this dynamic deployment model and how it has worked and how it has failed and how you can put resources in. If you continue with that type of model where you're going to be stretching ambulances over vast areas of the country, you need to see how much more resources you need to put in to be able to provide for that. Because it simply has not worked. And there needs to be recognition of that, I think, number one. And any new design of a system which can work in the future will clearly require more staff and more vehicles. And everyone that we speak to tells us that. And I want to commend Deputy Cullinan on bringing forward this motion, because it's something that not just from politically from Sinn Féin or from any side of the House, every deputy in here, every senator, every councillor in the country has been inundated with people, ordinary citizens out there, that when the last thing they expect when there's a crisis in their life, I don't know if when they go to hospital that there's waiting lists and there's all those things there, but that moment of crisis, that the state lets them down. I think that's absolutely paramount, that we deliver for the ordinary people out there that demand to have the service in place and to ensure that we have a proper ambulance service in place. Thank you very much.
I want to begin by acknowledging the work that paramedics do right across the state, day in, day out. They are the first on the scene to horrific incidents and tend to people at often the most frightening time of their lives. And they do all of this under immense and growing pressures. I also want to acknowledge the National Ambulance Service and the management team there. I went to them last year about an ambulance black spot in West Roscommon in my constituency. It had been identified by HICWA in 2014 as a black spot, and at that time there was just a day service Monday to Friday which closed at 6 o'clock and a night service on Saturdays and Sundays with no day service. There was only one permanent crew in place during that time, 4 people who were absolutely run ragged. I don't know how they did it, but for me they very much sum up the incredible commitment of our paramedics right across the state. And I'm bringing this issue to the attention of the National Ambulance Service. They conducted a report and they found that between January 2019 and October 2020, a staggering total of 4,259 calls were received for the Lough Lynn region, of which over 93% were emergency calls. And on the back of this report, the NAS agreed to make Lough Lynn 24/7. And I am grateful that the NAS not only listened, but they acted, and they did so very speedily. And I think now is the time that the government have to act, because while that was a positive and a good news story at long last for West Roscommon, we do have an issue in that there is a total lack of resources nationally, and that is stretching ambulances and paramedics that are on duty to the absolute limit. Every day, several texts a day are going out to paramedics offering overtime in different areas to cover shifts. In a lot of cases, they physically cannot be done. And I know of several that have gone out this week alone, just for Roscommon, Mayo and Galway. As has been said, paramedics are also working very dangerously long hours. I know of a shift last week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. They didn't get back to base till 3 the next morning. So there are issues. They need to be dealt with. They've been highlighted. And as has been said, this isn't Sinn Féin saying this. This is paramedics on the ground, and we need to act.
I heard what you said, Minister, and I appreciate it, and we appreciate as well that you're not contesting the motion. But we have to remember that our ambulance service, it's a critical service that everybody wants, but nobody hopes they're going to need. I'll never forget meeting a fireman who was on duty the night of the Stardust fire, and he recalls it being a very, very quiet night before all hell broke loose. And he said to me that, the emergency services, they're like an insurance policy, that we hope for the best when we're actually at our worst. And these services should never be run to their limits. We all feel that fear in our hearts when we're in traffic and you hear the siren from an ambulance, and you see traffic doing all kinds of manoeuvres to get out of the way, because instinctively we know that it's a matter of life or death. And we hope that if we need one, it'll come in time. But it won't if it's a Thursday and you're in Maynooth, Selbridge, Leixlip, Kilcock, or the northern hinterlands of my constituency, from Donnellytd to Johnstown Bridge, because there's no ambulance service operating from the Maynooth base from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. due to the austerity cuts from 2012. You can have a heart attack, a stroke or sever an artery any day except Thursday 7 to 7. Because with no ambulance from the Maynooth base, you'll be relying on an overstretched service from Naas or Tala, and time is of the essence, and that time can be lost. Jenny Moore contacted me last night to recall how she waited for an ambulance almost an hour and a half outside Selbridge after a head-on collision, fearing the worst for her son in the car beside her. I've also been contacted by a paramedic regarding 2 cardiac arrests in Leixlip, both on a Thursday morning last month, which had a delayed response time. Imagine the pressure that this puts on our wonderful paramedics who give 100% to their work, to the job and to the people that they come to help. The Taoiseach and yourself as well, you mentioned the community first responders last week, and I've been involved in Maynooth community first responders since I held a public meeting, and among a few of us, several of us established the group. But it is a volunteer group and they offer a superb service, but it should complement the state service, and no citizen should really have to be relying on the volunteers for their health, and no volunteer should either have to carry that burden of responsibility. So I'll finish with this. Our society has changed. People are less likely to interfere if they see some misdemeanour going on in the streets. But I think if we saw a vandal interfering with the wheels of an ambulance, we certainly would. And in its neglect of our ambulance services, the state is basically the vandal on the street, abusing our paramedic crews and taking the wheels off our ambulances. How we're treating our ambulance service, and the citizens depending on it, it really is a disgrace. And I leave it at that, Minister.
And I have listened to the Minister's response and your own response a few minutes ago, and I welcome that the Government isn't opposing this motion, because it's obvious to anybody who chooses to look that this service, like so many of our health services, really comes down to a postcode lottery, and this too is another service that's virtually on its knees. And Minister, you spoke about the valued and valuable community first responders in relation to Delta incidents, but they are community first responders. It is not their role, nor should it ever be relied upon by the state for volunteers to be the very first responder in every situation. And even those of us who have no medical training, I would be one of them, I understand that time is of the essence when it comes to emergency situations, and this is absolutely not the fault of the paramedics, of the professional and dedicated staff in the National Ambulance Service, because the responsibility and the blame for this, Minister, lies squarely with successive governments who have allowed the situation to develop. And I say that because it's been going on for a number of years. We all know of cases where people have been left waiting in pain and distress for an ambulance, and that's not good enough. But we also know of people who have lost their lives while waiting for an ambulance, and that is absolutely not good enough. Now, the staff of the ambulance service in Longford-Westmeath are absolutely burnt out. They truly, truly are. They are doing exhausting shifts and morale is on the floor. And as one paramedic put it to me this week, 3 hours in a queue with a suspected COVID patient. And also gave the example of, and I quote when I say this, drove like the clappers for 90 miles to get there and discover that the child had actually been unconscious for over 40 minutes after being knocked down. That is absolutely not good enough. But I do want to ask you these questions, Minister. How many people have applied for and accepted positions that they have been offered? Would be the first one. And the second one would be, what is the capacity of the National Ambulance Service training centres? Because what we have at the minute are managers and staff who are doing everything in their power, but they are operating in an area where there is impossible positions because there simply isn't enough of them. Now, we need to increase the numbers. We need to ensure that that system becomes robust so that when we speak again about community first responders, they are supplementing a service that's fit for purpose.
Minister, it's a sad reflection of our health services that many people cannot access a GP. Many people cannot get registered with a GP in some parts of Dublin, as you know, in some rural areas because of a shortage of GPs. We're now seeing waiting lists or waiting times for GPs. People contacting their GPs and in the past maybe getting an appointment on that day or 2 or 3 days now being pushed out to a week or longer. Out of hours GP services is inaccessible and not available to far too many patients. And that, I'm afraid, is putting huge pressure on our emergency departments because people are then going to our emergency departments because they don't have access to out-of-hours GP services. Dentists are leaving the dental treatment service scheme for medical card patients at a rate of knots. I know many medical card patients who can't get access to dental treatment as we speak. Far too many patients can't get access to a hospital bed. They're on trolleys. As was said earlier, the first case of a patient on trolley, 1998. Here we are with hundreds of patients every day on trolleys as if it's normal. They can't get access to a bed. And then we have ambulances parked up outside hospitals and can't transfer the patients into hospitals because the beds are not available. And we also have ambulance paramedics burnt out, stressed out, frontline staff burned out, stressed out. Many of them have said to me, one of them described it as hell today. And we don't appreciate the type of calls that they have to call out to. Children who are sick, children who are dying. They have to cut people out of cars. They tend to people who are reaching the end of their life after an emergency and an accident that happens on the side of the road. And they're the people that go out to respond to those calls. They're getting up every single day to do their job to keep us safe. And when they are saying to us that the system is not fit for purpose, that the system is unsafe, and they're saying it to me right across the board, from middle management to ambulance paramedics to EMTs, we have a responsibility to listen. Many of them, when they complete what would be a call that's hugely distressing or an accident that's hugely distressing, very often they don't get downtime. And moral injury kicks in again, where they just need time to recover. A child has died, an older person has died. They've been at the scene of an horrific car accident, and then within 5 and 10 minutes, they have to go again somewhere else and respond because of the pressures on the system. Like, that's unacceptable. Ambulance paramedics having to eat their lunch from the dashboard of their ambulance because they can't actually take the time to eat. They're doing 12-hour shifts, and then 10 to 15 minutes before their shift finishes, they get a call to say, can you go and respond to an accident that is 100 miles or 200 miles away? And they can't say no because of who they are, because of how they've been trained. As has been said, they are advanced paramedics, they are paramedics who are highly trained, highly specialised, and they love what they do. And they want to treat patients, and they will never refuse a call. But we cannot put that moral responsibility on them all of the time, that they can't take breaks, that they can't eat properly, that they're working sometimes 14, 15 days without leave, and then long shifts simply because of the lack of capacity in the system. So I would say to you, Minister, with respect to you and to the Minister for Health, who was here for most of the debate as well, I welcome the fact that additional funding has been put into the National Ambulance Service. Every single cent of additional funding is valued, and I certainly value that additional spend. But please don't not oppose the motion and then not implement its recommendations, because I don't want to be here in 6 months again, or a year or 2 years, still talking about the same problems. I understand that we can't solve all the problems overnight. So what do we need? A strategy that's properly funded, that sets out how and when we are going to increase the fleet and the personnel. And the Minister talked about it, training. I want to just mention one very quick point, if I can, Cian Corla, as I'm finishing, because the Minister said in his speech that the National Service Plan 2021 sets specific targets in relation to response times for life-threatening calls, but also for lower acuity calls. But he didn't say anywhere in his speech if we're meeting those targets. The truth is we're not meeting those targets, and that means we're failing patients, and we're also failing the people who work in the National Ambulance Service. Thank you
very much, Deputy Cullinan. Over Iver Agá Chéad. Tarishkent Mother Leshan Service Náisiúnta Óthar Car. The question now is that the amendment, this is amendment number 1, in the name of Deputy Breed Smith, be agreed to. Is the amendment agreed to?
Agreed.
Agreed. Is the motion as amended agreed to?
Agreed.
Agreed.